before anything else, a moment. Wherever you are right now, tucked beneath covers as darkness settles, navigating traffic while the world rushes past, preparing a meal in the quiet spaces between obligations, or seeking refuge from the endless scroll that never truly satisfies. Stop. Just for a breath. Just for this. This space isn't built for speed. It wasn't designed for dopamine hits or quick consumption. It exists for minds that prefer depth over distraction, understanding over entertainment, contemplation over consumption. We don't shout here. We don't perform. We think slowly and carefully about questions that actually matter. For those who value thoughtful exploration over rapid-fire facts, who understand that some truths take time to unfold properly, who recognize that the best stories can't be rushed, hit that subscribe button. It helps others find this refuge. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, what time of day you watch, how these videos fit into your life. Are you studying, fighting insomnia, seeking genuine curiosity in a world of manufactured outrage? Every voice matters here. Every listener shapes this community. Now, let's begin. Not with a neat answer, but with a question that's burned quietly through a million years of human silence, waiting for someone to finally ask it properly. Did we create fire? Or did we merely claim something that was never ours to begin with? Did we invent the flame, or just steal it from a world that was burning long before we arrived? Earth's flame, not ours. Think of fire not as humanity's achievement, but as the planet's ancient inheritance. Combustion predates consciousness by epochs so vast they mock our sense of time, reduce our entire species' existence to a flicker. Before any creature pondered its own existence, before wings evolved or eyes opened to witness them, before nervous systems developed the capacity for wonder, oxidation was already writing its story across barren continents in letters of ash and carbon. The geological record points us to the Silurian period, roughly 420 million years before the present moment. Try to picture this. Earth's surface was transforming in ways almost unrecognizable from our modern perspective. Simple plants, nothing remotely resembling the forests we know, were colonizing land for the first time in planetary history. These pioneers weren't dramatic. They weren't towering. They were low, creeping things with primitive vascular systems. But they brought something revolutionary with them from the seas. Organic tissue capable of desiccation. Potential fuel. 3 requirements enable fire, and only 3. Combustible material, sufficient oxygen, and an ignition source. Throughout most of Earth's early history, these elements never aligned properly. The chemistry was wrong. The atmosphere wasn't ready. But in the Silurian, atmospheric oxygen finally crossed a critical threshold, approximately 15% of total atmospheric composition. Combined with dead plant matter accumulating on primordial ground and occasional lightning strikes from primitive storm systems, combustion became chemically possible for the first time in planetary history. Our evidence comes from charcoal, fossilized plant carbon that survived partial burning. Unlike ash, which wind scatters and water dissolves back into mineral components, charcoal endures across geological time. It's remarkably stable. These carbonized fragments, locked inside sedimentary formations, like testimony sealed in stone, tell us about flames that burned when vertebrates were still exclusively aquatic, when no lung had ever drawn air, when no eye had ever witnessed combustion. Those initial fires weren't dramatic by modern standards. No towering infernos swept across continents. No forests were consumed because forests didn't exist yet. Instead, low-intensity burns crept slowly through primitive peat formations and moss colonies, consuming simple plant communities at a geological pace and depositing carbon layers that would eventually, over millions of years, compress into the coal deposits we extract and burn today. There's an irony there, burning ancient fire to power modern civilization. As plant evolution accelerated, species developing greater height, woody tissue, more complex reproductive and structural systems, fire discovered expanding opportunities. The fuel improved. By the Carboniferous period, approximately 350 million years ago, atmospheric oxygen had surged dramatically. Estimates from geochemical models suggest concentrations exceeded 30% compared to our current 21%. Imagine what that means for combustion dynamics. In such oxygen-enriched air, combustion itself fundamentally transformed. Fires ignited more easily from smaller sparks. They burned hotter, reaching temperatures impossible in modern atmospheres. They spread faster, consuming vegetation that today would resist ignition. They sustained themselves under conditions that would extinguish contemporary flames. Some paleoclimatologists call this interval the Age of Fire, a period when even relatively damp vegetation could sustain flames. When the very air seemed poised to burn, the ecosystem responded, evolved, adapted. The fossil record reveals emerging fire-adapted characteristics appearing in plant lineages: protective bark thickness increasing, heat-resistant seed coatings developing, rapid post-burn regeneration mechanisms evolving. Some plant lineages developed reproductive strategies requiring fire, seeds chemically programmed to germinate only after exposure to specific heat levels or particular smoke compounds. Fire wasn't destroying these ecosystems. It was sculpting them, selecting for specific survival strategies, shaping biodiversity itself. Yet fire's presence wasn't constant or guaranteed. During intervals when atmospheric oxygen declined below combustion thresholds for various geochemical reasons, flames essentially disappeared from Earth entirely. We identify these periods through charcoal gaps, geological strata spanning millions of years with zero combustion evidence, no burnt plant material, no fire-adapted traits appearing in the fossil record. The mechanisms driving these oxygen fluctuations remain partially mysterious, tied to volcanic activity patterns, massive carbon burial events that locked oxygen into sediments, and climate shifts operating on timescales that dwarf human comprehension. When dinosaurs dominated terrestrial ecosystems throughout the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous periods, fire had become Earth's established companion. Lightning-sparked wildfires regularly swept through conifer forests and fern meadows, clearing ground, resetting succession patterns, creating ecological mosaics. Research studying charcoal deposits suggests that around 90 million years ago, during the late Cretaceous, wildfires were so integral to certain ecosystems that removing fire would trigger catastrophic vegetation shifts. Take away the burning, and entire biomes would reorganize, species would vanish, new dominants would emerge. But through all this burning, across all these incomprehensible stretches of time, no animal controlled flame. No creature gathered around it with intention. No nervous system recognized its patterns or anticipated its behavior. Fire remained purely natural, sparked by atmospheric electricity, sustained by meteorological conditions, shaped by available fuel, but unclaimed by consciousness. It belonged to physics and chemistry alone. Then, 66 million years ago, the asteroid struck. The Cretaceous-Paleocene extinction event disrupted everything, including fire ecology. Immediate global conflagrations followed impact, then prolonged darkness blocking photosynthesis, then gradual ecosystem recovery over millions of years. Mammals diversified into ecological niches opened by extinction. Primates emerged, spread, evolved. But for tens of millions of years afterward, no evidence suggests deliberate fire interaction by any species. This brings us to the Miocene, approximately 7 million years ago. Not because fire changed. Fire was still fire, still burning according to immutable chemical laws. But the landscape transformed in ways that mattered. East African environments were shifting. Dense forest gave way gradually to grassland. Open savannas created new fire patterns, new burning regimes. Grass grows quickly, dries readily in seasonal droughts, burns fast when ignited. Lightning fires during dry seasons became predictable, frequent, almost clockwork. And in these transformed landscapes, early hominins were present. Australopithecus and related species, walking upright, using their hands, watching everything with increasingly capable eyes, watching the flames. What did Australopithecus see when fire crossed the savannah? What thoughts, if thoughts, even applies at this stage of cognitive evolution, pass through minds we can barely reconstruct? We'll never know their subjective experience directly. That's lost to time irrecoverably. Bones don't preserve terror or fascination. Fossilized sediment can't record the precise moment when curiosity first overcame deep-rooted instinct. But we can infer behavioral patterns from modern analogues, from ecological modeling, from careful interpretation of sparse archaeological context. Contemporary chimpanzees, our closest living genetic relatives, separated by only about 6 million years of evolutionary divergence, demonstrate remarkably clear fire awareness. Wild populations encountering advancing flames don't dissolve into panic. They don't scatter randomly. Instead, they observe carefully, assess wind direction and topographical features, predict movement patterns with apparent accuracy. Early Pleistocene savannas offered our hominin ancestors repeated fire encounters. Not occasional, not rare. Repeated, seasonal, predictable in rhythm, if not in exact timing or location. Seasonal lightning strikes ignited dry grass accumulated during long, dry months. Flames raced across open terrain following prevailing winds, creating ecological mosaics that could be read by observant eyes. Some areas burned completely, vegetation consumed entirely down to bare soil. Other patches escaped untouched through sheer chance, a shift in wind direction, a natural barrier, moisture content just barely sufficient to resist ignition. Within remarkably short time frames, sometimes within days of fire passage, fresh green shoots emerged from charred soil. The first plants to recolonize burned ground are often highly nutritious, lacking the chemical defenses and tough structures found in mature vegetation. Grazers, antelope, zebra, buffalo, migrated to these nutritious patches instinctively, drawn by smell, by visual cues, by inherited behaviors honed over evolutionary time. Scavengers followed the grazers. Predators followed the scavengers. The entire ecosystem reorganized itself around burn patterns. Fire didn't simply destroy in these landscapes. It fundamentally reset ecological succession, returned communities to earlier stages, created opportunities for species excluded from mature vegetation communities. And animals, including our early hominin ancestors, learned exploiting these resets. Not consciously learned in the modern pedagogical sense necessarily, but learned through experience, through trial and error, through the harsh, selective pressure of those who figured it out, surviving better than those who didn't. The burn zone itself offered multiple advantages beyond nutritional plants. Travel became easier, thorny undergrowth removed, sightlines extended, potential predator hiding spots eliminated. Visibility improved dramatically. Scorched tubers, cooked partially or fully by ground heat, could be collected more easily than digging deeply for raw equivalents. Small animals killed by flames, rodents, reptiles, insects, provided easy scavenging opportunities requiring minimal risk or energy expenditure. The warm, dry ground in the burn's immediate aftermath harbored fewer parasites and biting insects than shaded, moist vegetation zones. This represents what contemporary ecologists call passive interaction, benefiting from environmental processes without controlling them. We see this behavior pattern across the animal kingdom at various scales of sophistication. Birds worldwide exhibit various fire interaction behaviors. Australian raptors, documented extensively by indigenous observers and researchers, carry burning sticks intentionally to spread fires deliberately into unburned patches, flushing prey from cover into open ground where capture becomes easier. They don't create fire through any metabolic or mechanical process, but they manipulate it strategically with apparent intention and foresight. Certain insects navigate towards smoke and flame for warmth, or to exploit post-fire resources. Elephants linger near recent burns, feeding on tender, protein-rich regrowth. None of these behaviors require symbolic thought, abstract reasoning, or linguistic communication. They're functional responses, learned through observation and reinforced by success, shaped by natural selection, operating on behavioral flexibility. Early hominins fit comfortably within this established behavioral spectrum. Between 3 and 2 million years ago, species like Australopithecus afarensis and Australopithecus africanus increasingly occupied open habitats rather than remaining in forest refuges. Dental evidence from fossilized teeth reveals pronounced dietary shifts toward tougher, drier plant materials, seeds, nuts, roots, foods abundant in savanna environments, but requiring different processing than forest fruits. Some populations may have begun using crude stone flakes for cutting or pounding, though not yet in any standardized or consistently repeated ways that would indicate true tool culture. This combined ecological and cognitive flexibility likely heightened their environmental awareness dramatically, including sensitivity to fire patterns and fire-created opportunities. Intelligence, even in rudimentary forms, means noticing patterns others miss, making connections others don't, responding to environments in novel ways that improve survival odds. Fire presented opportunities for exactly this kind of intelligence to demonstrate selective advantage, but we must be rigorous. We must be careful. No archaeological evidence whatsoever suggests these early hominins captured fire, stored it, transported it, or deliberately used it to modify their own behavior in any permanent or culturally transmitted ways. No hearth remains exist from this enormous time span. No soot layers correlate with stone tool deposits. No charcoal concentrations indicate controlled or contained combustion. Fire at this stage, across these millions of years, remained entirely wild, entirely natural. Its rhythm belonged to climate patterns and atmospheric electricity, not to hominid planning or intention. Yet despite this lack of control, evolutionary pressure was definitely building. As savanna fires increased in frequency, with ongoing climate change favoring grassland expansion, they shaped not just terrain, but the selective forces acting on populations inhabiting that terrain. Groups developing enhanced fire avoidance skills, recognizing danger signs, choosing safe refuge locations, moving efficiently to minimize exposure, would suffer fewer injuries and deaths. Groups understanding safe following distances and optimal post-burn foraging timing and locations may have gained significant nutritional advantages, accessing food sources before competitors arrived or resources became depleted. Over geological time measured in tens or hundreds of thousands of years, these repeated encounters fostered growing familiarity, not intimacy, not friendship, familiarity. The distinction matters enormously. Familiarity breeds not contempt, but confidence, reduces the paralyzing effects of fear, enables more nuanced behavioral responses than simple flight. Familiarity allows observation rather than panic, learning rather than pure instinct. Familiarity isn't control. The distinction is crucial, but it's prerequisite. You can't control what you don't understand. You can't understand what you haven't observed. Before fire could be made, it required being known in deep, intuitive ways. Before knowing could emerge from observation, repeated encounters across many contexts were necessary. The savanna landscape provided exactly that. Not dramatic education, not sudden revelation, but repeated exposure, season after season, generation after generation. From strict scientific perspective, this entire period presents extraordinary research challenges. No charred artifacts survive for laboratory analysis. No chemical residues persist in sufficient quantity for precise dating. No constructed features exist for spatial mapping and interpretation. Instead, researchers must work with indirect evidence, paleo-environmental reconstructions built from pollen cores and soil analyses, sediment cores showing cyclical burning patterns, fossil assemblages suggesting subtle shifts in foraging strategies and habitat preferences over time. It's painstaking, uncertain detective work, attempting to reconstruct behavioral context rather than specific events, demanding intellectual humility at every stage. We can't claim direct knowledge about hominid subjective experience, emotional states, or decision-making processes. We can only attempt understanding what their environment presented, what opportunities and challenges existed, what selective pressures operated. Questions persist without clear answers. Did fire terrify them? Almost certainly yes. It still frightens us, still triggers deep instinctive responses, despite intellectual understanding. But did it also captivate them? Did they pause, partially concealed in vegetation, watching flames traverse grassland in hypnotic patterns, feeling radiant heat from what they judged to be safe distance? Did they notice how predators, the cats, the hyenas, maintained cautious spacing from advancing fire lines? Did they observe grass blackening, then the green shoots emerging days later? These specific questions lack confident answers. They likely always will, but they're worth holding in mind, worth contemplating seriously, because somewhere in this vast temporal and psychological space between fear and familiarity, the long arc ultimately connecting fire and humanity begins its gradual, almost imperceptible bend, not toward immediate mastery, not toward sudden control, toward awareness, toward recognition, toward the slow, dawning realization that landscapes could transform suddenly, violently, and then recover predictably. We don't know when the first hominid made the decision to walk toward a burn scar instead of instinctively away from it. We don't know when. It's tempting imagining everything began with invention. Fire as sudden inspirational breakthrough, singular moment of Promethean brilliance, one clever individual having an unprecedented insight. But truth, at least as revealed through careful scientific investigation, typically unfolds slower, less dramatically, more incrementally than our narrative preferences suggest. Our fire relationship likely began not with struck flint sparking kindling, but with quiet, sustained, multi-generational observation. Footprints pressed into ash-covered ground, eyes slowly adjusting to recognize glow on the horizon as neither mystery nor monster, but predictable phenomenon. Cautious steps forward, not to control or claim, but simply to follow, to witness, to learn. Northern Kenya holds a place called Kubi Fora. Between 1.9 and 1.5 million years ago, Homo erectus walked these shores, taller than predecessors, with cranial capacity beginning its upward trajectory. Their anatomy suggests endurance, bodies built for sustained walking across open terrain. Excavations revealed peculiarities, sediment patches differing from surrounding matrix, reddish-orange tinting, heat penetration extending centimeters below surface, not merely sunbaked, but transformed. These alterations weren't randomly distributed. They occurred in discrete zones, often associated with stone tools and fossilized bone fragments. Some bones showed burning indicators, darkened edges, cracked surfaces. Nothing spectacular, but enough raising questions. The most conservative interpretation invokes geology. Perhaps volcanic activity or lightning strikes caused these patterns. But the distribution suggests something more localized, circular formations rather than broad bands. Then there's the lithic material. Archaeologists found heat-modified stone. Some flakes exhibited thermal fractures consistent with high-temperature exposure. The pattern matched fire-altered contexts, uneven spalling, surface crazing, glossy sheens forming when stone exceeds 200 degrees Celsius. In the same layers containing heated stones, we find traces of Homo erectus associated with more complex stone tool traditions. The Acheulean industry, hand axes, bifacial implements with symmetrical edges, not merely broken rock, but deliberately shaped instruments. So the question becomes, did Homo erectus discover fire or follow it? There's no definitive evidence for control, no hearths, no constructed fire pits. But growing suspicion suggests something shifting. One possibility, opportunistic use. Imagine lightning started fire, killing small animals, charring roots. Next morning, a Homo erectus group approaches. They scavenge. They rest in residual warmth. Maybe they carry a smoldering stick briefly. It's speculative. But Kubi Fora offers among the earliest places where such questions gain archaeological grounding. The evidence is scattered, partial, controversial. But it reminds us knowledge begins slowly, not through genius flashes, but through patterns, exposure, repetition. Around 400,000 years ago, something shifts. At sites across Europe and the Middle East, fire evidence becomes less ambiguous. At Beech's Pit in England, archaeologists discovered hardened patches of reddened earth within shallow basins, surrounded by charcoal and burned bone. The patterns suggested sustained heating from within. Near these features, hundreds of stone tools, butchered animal remains, evidence of prolonged occupation. People were living here, incorporating fire into their living patterns. At Schöningen in Germany, wooden spears show signs of deliberate fire hardening. The spear tips had been charred, their surfaces chemically altered to increase strength. Creating such spears requires multi-stage processing. Too much heat and the wood becomes brittle. Too little and nothing changes. At Tabun Cave in Israel, repeated ash layers and burned flint appear across multiple stratigraphic levels. No formal fireplaces, but consistent evidence of fire in particular locations. The same areas used again and again across generations. The hominin species responsible were likely Homo heidelbergensis, with brain sizes approaching modern human ranges. They lived during climatic instability. Glacial at Kesem Cave in Israel, dating to about 400,000 years ago, researchers found a central hearth zone approximately 2 meters wide, surrounded by tool-making debris and butchered bones. Ash accumulated across multiple layers, suggesting the same location was used repeatedly over extended periods. The hearth's centrality is what strikes researchers most. It occupied the cave's central area, with tool manufacture and food processing clustered around it. This configuration suggests fire had evolved beyond pure utility into something organizational, a focal point for group activity. What does it mean to have a hearth? At basic level, it means warmth. But there's more than thermodynamics. The consistent presence of fire suggests something social, something shared. Flame is hard to divide. The fire draws you back. It gathers, it holds. The inhabitants of Kesem Cave were likely a transitional population. Their teeth and bones show a mixture of traits, some archaic, some surprisingly modern. What is clear? They were beginning to live in ways no species before them had managed, not just surviving in a landscape, but building a relationship with a specific place and with the fire that lived there. To be clear, this was not yet full fire mastery. There's still no solid evidence these hominins could create fire on demand. More likely, they maintained fire from natural sources, carrying embers, feeding flames with dry dung or wood, nurturing coals to last the night. But maintaining fire requires planning, vigilance, cooperation. You cannot keep a hearth alive alone. One of the more compelling aspects of Kesem is what it suggests about return. This wasn't a seasonal camp, briefly occupied then abandoned. It was used over generations. The hearth was not just a tool, it was a landmark, a memory site. People who lived here did not sit in cozy circles telling myths. They were butchers and foragers. They broke bones for marrow. Their lives were shaped by climate shifts and predator threats. But even in that world, they kept the fire burning. And habit, in evolutionary terms, is no small thing. At Pinnacle Point in South Africa, approximately 160,000 years ago, people were doing something sophisticated, heat-treating stone. Silkrete, a challenging material to work in its natural state, becomes easier to shape after controlled heating. Archaeological experiments replicating this process demonstrate the precision required. Heat the stone too quickly and it fractures. Insufficient temperature produces no change. Achieving the right conditions demands careful fire management, maintaining consistent heat for hours. The implications extend beyond individual cleverness. Heat treatment knowledge had to be learned, remembered, and transmitted. You can't discover the right temperature through casual observation. Someone experimented, perhaps over generations, accumulating knowledge that was then taught to others. Similar evidence appears at Blombos Cave and other South African sites between 100,000 and 70,000 years ago. The regional pattern suggests cultural continuity, populations maintaining and sharing specialized fire knowledge. This is fire as technology, deliberate heat applied not for necessity, but for enhancement. These early humans weren't just surviving, they were engineering. Between 200,000 and 100,000 years ago, anatomically modern humans began moving across northern Africa and into Asia. Fire appears at many sites left behind by these migrating bands. But there's a detail most people overlook. There's almost no clear evidence of anyone creating fire during this time. The theory many researchers now consider is not one of invention, but of preservation. Early humans, still lacking reliable means of starting fire from scratch, learned how to keep it alive instead. How do you move with fire? One option: carry embers carefully insulated in slow-burning material like dried dung or fungus. Experiments show that embers can be kept smoldering for hours, even a full day, provided conditions are stable. There's ethnographic precedent. Among indigenous groups from Australia to North America, fire preservation was often more crucial than fire starting. Stories and taboos sometimes surrounded the act of keeping flame alive. If you lost it, you had to borrow it from another group or wait for lightning. Archaeological evidence gives hints. In sites like Jebel Irhoud in Morocco and Mislia Cave in Israel, burnt materials appear alongside stone tools. But there's no clear starter, no flint and pyrite, no drill, no tinderbox. To carry fire is to shelter it. Wind can kill it, rain can drown it. So the very act of preserving flame may have forced our ancestors to invent new forms of enclosure, to develop routines of returning each evening to the same burned patch. What we begin to glimpse is not yet a technological revolution, but something slower. Fire as an inheritance, fire as responsibility, fire as continuity. So perhaps the real story of fire and humanity isn't about invention or conquest, isn't about clever individuals making breakthrough discoveries, isn't about our species' innate superiority or unique destiny. It's about relationship, a million-year conversation between clever but vulnerable primates and an elemental force that shaped Earth's ecosystems for hundreds of millions of years before primates even existed. We didn't make fire. That claim, examined closely, crumbles under scrutiny. We found it burning across landscapes we inherited. We feared it, reasonably, as any sensible organism would fear a force capable of destroying forests and consuming flesh. We studied it, gradually, across countless generations, leaving no written records. We learned to predict its patterns, to recognize favorable and dangerous conditions, to exploit its aftermath. Eventually, though we don't know precisely when or where or how, we learned to kindle it ourselves. But that came last, not first. Control came after millions of years of coexistence. Each step in this progression took immeasurable time, uncounted human generations, born and dying without seeing meaningful change. Most of the people who contributed incrementally to this cumulative learning are completely forgotten. They have no names. They left no monuments. Only traces remain. Ash layers compressed in cave sediments, heat-altered stones bearing microscopic evidence of thermal transformation. spatial patterns in archaeological sites, suggesting intentional behavior we can barely interpret. But their legacy persists in everything we do. Every time we light a match, without thinking, strike a lighter automatically, adjust a thermostat unconsciously, we're inheriting knowledge accumulated across deep time through processes we don't acknowledge. We stand on work done by minds we can barely imagine, brains smaller than ours, lacking language as we know it, living in circumstances of deprivation we find almost impossible to conceptualize from our climate-controlled comfort. The fire we use today isn't fundamentally different from what they knew. It's the same chemistry, operating by the same physical laws, presenting the same basic requirements and dangers. We've just packaged it differently through technological innovation, scaled it enormously through industrial processes, embedded it so deeply into infrastructure that we forget it's there, humming beneath our daily lives. Sometimes we succeed in this management. Sometimes, as news from California and Australia and Greece and Canada reminds us annually, fire reminds us sharply of our limits. Walking through these million years of fragmentary evidence, sparse, ambiguous, frustratingly incomplete, constantly being revised as new discoveries emerge or old interpretations get challenged, we encounter profound humility if we're paying attention. How much we don't actually know despite centuries of scientific investigation. How much remains genuinely mysterious despite all our tools and techniques. How many questions may remain permanently unanswerable because evidence simply doesn't preserve across such vast timescales. The story we can honestly tell, stripped of mythology and cultural bias and wishful thinking, is this. Fire shaped our physical evolution through selective pressures we're still mapping, influenced our cognitive development in ways we're still trying to understand, structured our social organization in patterns still visible today. It gave us warmth, extending our range into cold climates. It gave us light, extending our usable hours beyond daylight. It gave us protection from predators that fear flames. It gave us technological capability to transform materials through heat. It demanded attention, forcing sustained focus. It required cooperation, because maintaining fire across generations exceeds individual capacity. It rewarded patience and punished carelessness with lethal efficiency. It gathered us into circles that may have fostered language development, social bonding, cultural transmission. It extended our days, creating time for activities beyond immediate survival. It protected us from threats while presenting new dangers. And through all of this, across all these millennia, one fundamental fact remains unchanged. We never controlled fire completely, never achieved total mastery, never transcended the basic reality that fire serves us only when we respect its nature. We just learn to work with it, sometimes successfully, sometimes catastrophically, always walking a line between benefit and disaster. The first spark we struck, whenever and wherever that actually happened, because honestly, we still don't know for certain, didn't make us masters of fire, despite how the myths read. It made us participants in something ancient, something powerful, something ultimately beyond complete control, regardless of our technological sophistication. We carry that spark still, metaphorically and literally. What we do with it, how carefully we tend it, how wisely we use it, how honestly we acknowledge both its gifts and its dangers, that remains our choice and our responsibility. The flame still burns. The question is what we'll do with it next. Thank you for walking this timeline with me, for slowing your pace, for sitting patiently with uncertainty and questions that span millions of years without easy answers. If this helped you sleep, if it gave you something to think about, if it simply provided refuge from the noise and speed of modern existence for a little while, then I'm genuinely grateful you were here. Your attention is a gift in this age of infinite distraction. Consider subscribing if long-form, thoughtful, carefully researched content speaks to you. It helps others find this kind of space. Leave a comment about where in the world you're listening from, what time of day this reaches you, how these videos fit into your life. Building community around curiosity and humility and patience matters. Every voice helps shape what we become. And as always, stay curious about things that matter. Stay calm in a world that profits from your anxiety. I'll see you in the next story. Until then, remember, the fire we carry was never really ours to begin with. We just learned to tend it well enough to survive. Maybe that's enough. Maybe that has to be